When we began working at a small scale with installations and self-generated projects, we felt that we were outsiders to the discipline, and this is the only way that we can actually have a public forum, sometimes by willing projects into public spaces. As our practice continued, there were different trajectories of research and performance and work in new media, but also architecture started to become more and more possible. Our work started really with a first residential project, followed by a large housing project in Japan, followed by a museum. And so those projects were integrated also with the independent projects and parallel to and informed each other. To this day, we do independent projects that are based on ongoing research, sometimes opportunities that we get, sometimes we find them. We don't see the practice as having grown from small to large. We see it as having more and more channels of expression, different media, different scales, and I think that that's always going to happen because we're endlessly curious to find new challenges, and those challenges come at all scales. The Shed is an initiative that we brought to the table around 11 years ago, but there was no institution, there was really no client. So we made a proposal for a new type of institution that we were just speculating about. And about 3 years into our speculative work, the city sort of took much more interest. Then I would say in around 2012, there started to become a client, but we were also the client. And basically invented the building and invented a kind of ethos for this project. And fundamentally it has to do with bringing all the visual arts and performing arts, all the creative disciplines under one roof, but not only to just succeed each other and use various places, but literally to converge and be able to work across disciplines. So the building is extremely flexible in terms of infrastructure. Its size can change. It's a space that we imagine creative people could just inhabit and knock around a lot. With the London Symphony, it's a different project. So we have an orchestra of great repute. There's a necessity to really make a great concert hall with great acoustics. But at the same time, what's the future of classical music? Of course, it's going to be there for a long time, forever. But at the same time, there are new composers that are being commissioned to do new things. And contemporary artists think across media. And so the challenge for us, and we really feel up to the challenge, is to figure out how to make a great place for classical music, for an orchestra, but make it flexible enough to work across media and different platforms, different scales into the future. I would say it's a different form of flexibility. So there are permanent components that are character defining, but and this is something that I find really very, very, very important, that flexibility is usually equated with kind of generic form. And I strongly feel that it's possible to do something that's very flexible and give it an identity, express the time that it was made, and also be open-ended so that it feels forever contemporary. It's a really difficult puzzle to solve, but that's the challenge. How do you make something for contemporary used for contemporary audiences that feels contemporary in 20 years. The High Line, when it was initially imagined, was to be for about 400,000 people a year. That's what we projected. It's a part of the city that has very little green space, and it was a really novel idea to use existing infrastructure that was obsolete to create that green space. What happened was entirely unexpected. It became a great tourist attraction. And it catalyzed the transformation of the area. It was intended to help that area, which was just a sea of open parking lots at the time. So there were still a couple of businesses that were functioning, but in the end, it didn't displace so many people, but it didn't look into the future and the city didn't really imagine that how quickly that the property values would rise around there. And the effect of that is rapid gentrification. So in that it is a new part of the city, it's important to think about how to make sure that a cross-section of the city's population is able to afford to be there. And therefore, it's part of the city. And if that doesn't happen, it feels very alienating. And so question is, would we have designed it any differently? Probably not. We did the best job we could to make a public park. I wish we had bought a couple of apartments and invested in the area, but we weren't smart enough to do that. I think that the city learned something, and I think that the many High Lines that are appearing all around the world have something to learn about thinking into the future. I would say that Moscow is entirely different. So a very large piece of property where the Hotel Rossiya once stood, which was a 3,000-room Soviet-era hotel. The site is right next to the Kremlin, right next to Red Square, and on the river. And we wanted to make a park, a civic space, an open space that was very, very different than the parks in Russia today, and especially in Moscow. A park that didn't delineate routes, a park that didn't make formal axes, a park that invited you to sit on the grass. And the effect of the project has been really incredible. It's been wildly successful. 1 million people visited the first month. It's very, very different from the High Line. It's not a promenade. It's the project. It's not essentially from scratch because it's built on foundations, but effectively it is green and you can walk in any direction. Today there are hundreds of High Line type structures being built all over the world, and I would say that they're all very, very different, and the projects that we're doing are very different. The High Line is really important to us in that it's an adaptive reuse project. So we're taking something that could have been taken down, and the area would have developed anyway. New York is a real estate town, so every square inch is very expensive. The sort of great thing that happened there is by saving the High Line, we actually protected public space from privatization, and that's a really good thing. I'm really proud of that. And also, it's a time to think about limited resources, and I think any time that any one of these High Lines around the world is using actually a highway or an existing bridge that's obsolete, anything like that, it's actually a really good thing. An architect can't just parachute into a place and pretend to understand it There are so many sort of common issues globally that I sort of feel like I can dive into regarding new institutions, regarding education, public space, but each location is really nuanced, and I have to say that one has to just get started and allow the context to just, through osmosis, to sort of get into your head. In the States, we don't have a very deep history of architecture or planning. And I think that's part of the challenge, that cities aren't really so well planned. So whoever is the biggest bidder really gets to do what they want. I really think of the city as a project, not just a plot of land. So it's really important to think broadly. Some cities actually have city architects that can, have a broad vision and imagine how everything integrates. In New York, we have a planning commission. We had a fantastic commissioner when we were doing at the beginning of the High Line and the Shed. That was very conscious, but the effects are very, very limited of what they can do. So in the end, it's a very real estate oriented city. So, and I think that that's similar to many cities like LA and Chicago, many of the big cities in Texas. There's just a lot of new construction going on, a boom, and buildings are looking very much the same. And I think it's a problem. The effect of Trump, I think, has not entirely been felt yet through the profession. However, it's produced more activists. So I notice that my students are really angry. They're not sure what to do about it. They're not sure how to channel their anger. But I think it's producing a more activist generation that I hope is going to try to find more agency in the discipline to make changes and not rely on the government. Specifically, some of the tariffs that are imposed on imported goods and so forth are actually challenging for U.S. architects because everything is being inflated right now. Prices are being inflated, and it's more expensive to build. So I think that there are some, probably some backfires, that are happening there. But I think generally speaking, we're all, just hoping that, very short time, we'll see somebody else in the White House. I teach at Princeton. 50% of my class is composed of women, and only about 15 or 20% in my own studio. And so there is a problem from school to the profession that really needs to be cured. It's a great initiative, actually, to foreground women who are practicing, who are accomplishing things. Some of my colleagues that have gotten this award prior are fantastic, and they're trailblazers, and they need to be acknowledged. So, also that it's not quite so fair when you look at Pritzker Prize and you look really, the severity is right there, it's very obvious. But architecture has been a male-oriented, male-dominated profession for a long time. The notion of that singular white male heroic figure has been out there. It's been, it's in Hollywood movies. It's been written about, and that it just sort of clings to the minds of people with the power and the money and the wherewithal to commission architects to do projects. So I think it's part of it is just changing the public perception part of it is allowing women to grow and rise quickly, into important positions in firms. And so, I think that the Jane Drew Prize is doing its fair share in helping the effort.